any team, no matter how good they are, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, etc., they just can't try out as many things as the open source community can. So it makes sense for OpenAI to put some of these things out, let people try it out and see, okay, do people have a better way of doing this? Maybe even OpenAI is not the best guys at making operator. Maybe the Chinese startup has got some nice hacks in their prompt or in whatever that they're able to use these sort of open source tools.
Hello, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. How are you doing? You're just back from Vegas, is that right?
I'm back from Las Vegas, where there was this new event called Human X, where a lot of the AI companies were gathered. One of the biggest lines of people trying to get into one of the talks was for the session given by Kevin Weil, who's the CPO, Chief Product Officer of OpenAI, for a Q&A session. And that came on the day that they released their latest API and SDK for agents, which we want to talk about today.
Yeah, they certainly had a very, very big launch this week, and it's kind of I it's kind of put to bed some things that we'd thought before about whether they cared about developers anymore or not. This was all developers, this thing. So I think this is one of the things that has really sort of seen the change in that almost all the things that they've released up until this recently in regards to agents, we've had the deep research, we've had operators, stuff like that. Those had tools and stuff at the behind them. And this week, basically, OpenAI has made all that available for developers to make their own versions of those kinds of agents.
So let's jump in. They've got this new API called Responses API, where they're bringing in some of these new tools like web search, file search and filtering, and computer use, as you say, that they had kind of been working on the side to bring it all together in this new API. And then they've got this agents SDK separately, right? Which is where you allow these agents to hand tasks off to specific agents that are very competent in these areas. What it seems to show is that OpenAI is ahead of the competition, right? In terms of providing this functionality. It's a bringing together two important things, right? So it's avoiding this API and a loop problem, right? Where constantly have to call on the API and you're dealing with issues around memory and knowledge and state, and bringing it all into one place with an agent orchestration framework, which is the second point, right? Directly in the API, right? So allowing dynamic tool use, and basically nodding to production grade agents.
The thing that people need to understand is that the OpenAI API now is the de facto standard, not just for an OpenAI LLM, but for lots of other LLMs as well. So, for example, Gemini, right, can actually support the OpenAI API. You just don't point it at OpenAI, you point it at Google. The same is true for Olama. The same is true for a lot of these things. So, them making a change in their API is actually quite big because you can imagine that a lot of people are going to sort of fall in line and support these other changes as well. And the change that they made is really kind of interesting. So, if we go back in sort of history, originally people would just call these models, you would basically pass in a string, you would get sort of a continuation of that back, right? This is what they originally called the completions API. Then they moved to a chat API, which was heavily influenced by ChatGPT. And now they're moving to this responses API. And this responses API, you could sort of say, well, this is now taking sort of a little bit of the best of everything, but it's really kind of aimed at, okay, you don't just want to use this as a sort of chat model anymore. You want to use it as an agent. You want to be able to use tools with it. You want to be able to get it to do function calling and help you with things like that. You want it to be able to do the browser use. All this sort of stuff is now sort of baked into this new API. And I think this is, fundamentally a big deal just by itself. Even if they hadn't released the other things, this alone is kind of signaling to the market where things are going.
So during their demo, when they released it 2 days ago, they had the style assistant. They have this triage agent at the top, basically handing tasks to one, a stylist agent that can check a file about your clothing habits, right? And look for stores in your location where you can actually buy these things. That's all within like one agent, right? And then you have this the second agent, which is a customer support agent, which can call on various other tools like past orders that you've made, refund requests, right? If you bought something you want a refund. I thought that was really interesting. Then the second example that came out was a tweet from Stripe, where it showed that it had actually already started working with this. It showed how extensible it is, right? That Stripe had built its own functions and agents that you can then you have embraced within this OpenAI SDK, right? So it showed an example of how you can pay contractors with Stripe after looking through files on who of your contractors needs to be paid and how much they need to be paid. And Stripe has built these agents that others can use as well.
Don't forget, this is not the first time that OpenAI's had a bite at this apple, right? Actually, what they've released this week is replacing. They've already announced they're going to deprecate their assistance API, in the middle of next year. And to be honest, I don't think many people are using that API anyway. It's been a pretty much of a flop of an API, right? So they've been on their back foot to realize that they needed to come up with something new and something better for this. A while back, I think it's like about October last year, they released this sort of example framework that they called Swarm at the time. Now, that is basically what has become the agent SDK now. They've just fleshed it out a bit. When they released that, that was really just sort of them giving their ideas on how they thought agent frameworks should be. That perhaps they weren't that happy with like what some of the other players in the market were doing. They were sort of like, okay, this is sort of like how we imagine it. While that was really popular and people tried to use it and put it into production, even though OpenAI said, hey, this is not ready for production, it was really clear that they needed to come out with something on their own. Otherwise, they were going to have to fall in line with the Lang chains, with the Pydantic AI, frameworks, etc., that are out there. And so I think them releasing the Agent SDK, announcing that they're getting rid of the assistant SDK is probably, their latest attempt at being able to do this. I got to say it's their best attempt that I've seen, right? It really doesn't have the flaws that they had in the assistance API. It's much more geared to being an open source framework. One of the things that seems quite interesting with it already is that because so many people support that OpenAI API that I talked about before, you can actually use the agents SDK with other providers. It doesn't have to be just with OpenAI. So I'm not seeing people sort of talk about that. But it seems to me that OpenAI have understood that, like, okay, well, maybe in the future, people are going to have specialized models. And I think this is one of the interesting things about that responses API is that they sort of declare that, okay, for chat models, we will keep the chat API with the completions, but not all our models are going to support that in the future. So this sort of hints at sort of specialized models coming down, whether they're reasoning models that are really not for chat, they're just for reasoning over something, whether they're agent specific models that are only supposed to do something, particular for the agent, perhaps things, like the web search and stuff like that. All of these things are sort of showing, tipping their cards slightly to show the new direction that they're going is this sort of agentic application. And this sort of agentic world that we're moving to. We're sort of getting glimpses of OpenAI's internal thinking about these things. They're now set up to roll out a bunch more sort of tools that will enable people to sort of, make use of this even more.
The strategic hand that they've shown that you just referred to, you've been saying in the past, or maybe it was conjecture that they weren't going to release everything through the API, right? That they potentially wanted people to be using their OpenAI product, right? The one we all use and pay monthly for. And so, why would they want to put things through an API and get gobbled up by others potentially in the market, right? So, maybe you've referred to them already in part, but what do you think the big implications of this are?
If you look at the blog post, what do they say? They talk about new tools for building agents. And then they say, to build useful and reliable agents. That word reliable is so key. We've talked about it many times on the pod before, that most of the agents are just not reliable. And so OpenAI is looking at, like, okay, how do we bring this sort of reliability in? And this is their sort of way of trying to do that, to stop endless loops in agents, to be able to have tools. But at the same time, they kind of admit they've given us this computer use tool, which supposedly is what's behind Operator. But even they say, you really should have a human watching it all the time, right? It's not really good enough. And their own sort of benchmarks show that, I think it's sort of like working half of the time, or, it's certainly not a perfect thing. We've also seen the other interesting sort of thing on the side that's maybe been a distraction is this whole thing around Manus this week. It seems that most of the tech that they used was just off the shelf open source stuff.
Just briefly talk what Manus is, right? It's this company in China that released this really powerful reasoning, autonomous agent platform that could do a lot of things that others like Anthropic and OpenAI are already doing. And people were talking about it as a DeepSeek 2 moment, right? But it turns out it was all built on Claude and Quen.
For me, I don't see that as a bad thing, right? That they're using stuff already out there. What I think is really interesting is that they managed to work out how to get that tech to work together to make something that was really impressive for a lot of people. Maybe even OpenAI is not the best guys at making Operator. Maybe, like, the Chinese startup has got some nice hacks in their prompt or in whatever, that they're able to use these sort of open source tools. Just like it's good for Meta to open source Llama, in that they basically benefit from learning, how people are using that externally and are able to update, how they're using it internally. Same for OpenAI with their tools, right? As people start to use the computer use tool themselves, people are going to sort of work out, like, okay, these are the best prompts, or this is how to double check it to make sure that it works and stuff. So I think they realize that, any team, no matter how good they are, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, etc., they just can't try out as many things as the open source community can. So it makes sense for OpenAI to put some of these things out, let people try it out and see, okay, do people have a better way of doing this?
So Operator's not perfect, but they bring it into the API so you could use it. But then the SDK is allowing you to extend and use other solutions. But it's also a risk, right? Is in that if they are bringing it onto the API, then they're conceding control, right? So that experiences can be built by others like Manus and other enterprise companies. I mean, companies that are bigger than Manus, right? And so and more is so it's very open. So it's a big risk. But as you say, maybe it's the only play they could make, given what we've seen so far with DeepSeek and Manus.
In some ways, they would much rather that the open source work out how to do it with their tools than Google work out how to do it internally, right? Or AWS or Anthropic or any of the other, their main
Right.
competitors. So they definitely benefit, from it in that way. I don't see that. And at the end of the day, the simple fact is that they're still making money from you using these tools. I and the tools are, like the search tool is up to sort of 5 cents a call, right? If you're using the full big GPT-4o1 and you're using the high context, I think they call it, that's 5 cents US per call. So if you're doing, lots of calls on that, they're probably making some money on that as well. So,
Right.
that's something, and you got to think that it also is good for them to offer that, because Google's been offering that for the past few months, right? So they don't want Google to get a foothold with their Gemini models in just because they've got search and OpenAI is not offering the search.
Right.
So I do think that this announcement really is a big win for developers. It gives them access to a lot of these things, but it's also a win for OpenAI, right? OpenAI is now going to get to see all the cool stuff that people can make with this. If you look at one of the things that we didn't mention yet that they released, is this whole observability and traceability thing. I'm actually kind of anti this, right? In that, what this basically does, you can use it to track not only all your LLM calls where it will record them, but all your tool calls, anything else that you want to have in your agent, so that then you can go through and see, what went right, what went wrong with your agent. Now, I love that concept, right? That's an awesome concept. I just don't like the idea of giving all that valuable IP to OpenAI by uploading it all to them or to any of the other providers. I kind of feel like there are a number of open source solutions that already do this. You're probably better to serve it yourself, go for it yourself, especially if you're a company with some sort of original IP around agents. That really prompts are sort of one of the best forms of intellectual property at the moment, right? If you've got some trick that you know how to get an agent to do something reliably and other people don't know that, you don't want to be going and giving that away to people.
Fascinating trade-offs that OpenAI has been playing with, and it feels like this is the move that they needed to make. In the history of Silicon Valley, and when you see some of these revolutions, often going open is a sign of potential weakness in the sense that, hey, you're not so far ahead in the technology that you can keep it closed, right? Usually it's the player number two, right? Apple was ahead, and then Google open sources. It's a player number two that opens to catch up, right? Meta obviously opening up and trying to catch up that way.
I think that holds true to an extent. The only thing that's different now is that things are moving at just such speed.
There's so much nuance here, right? So they're opening up on the SDK to allow the thousand flowers to bloom. But it's interesting. Let's go to this tweet that from Ashpreet Bedi, who's running a startup called Agno AGI, that had a framework, kind of an API approach that OpenAI had. It's one of these companies that's potentially going to be steamrolled by OpenAI. And so he's referring to, first of all, in his tweet, how his model obviously was right, that OpenAI has actually kind of confirmed that this is the right direction. But he's referring to how there is some lock-in. Sam, let's talk briefly about that, right? Where it looks like in the API, there's a prevention of simple changes to this base URL. And this effort at lock-in isn't good. The companies are going to want, kind of a more model agnostic framework. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of this part?
His framework, which used to be called Data, I actually think is a very nice framework, right? It's very elegant. The issue that all these people are going to have, though, is there's just so many frameworks, and the only ones with a real sort of foothold at the moment are the Lang chains, the Crew AIs, and probably after this week, the Agent SDK from OpenAI.
What about AutoGen, right? From Microsoft, right?
Oh, yeah, the good point. Yeah, AutoGen, they've got Microsoft, they've got a really cool team that's basically open sourcing a lot of things like the Magentic AI or Magentic One that we looked at in the past,
Right.
which those kind of things is what will drive adoption, I feel.
Okay, so let's go briefly to the next point, Sam, which is where your expertise comes in, right? Does this work, right? How big of a deal is this, right? We talk about, OpenAI releasing Operator, releasing tasks, right? They've got all these bugs and it's just not production ready, right? As you mentioned, even, the assistance API, right? It was, you called it a flop. Is this production ready?
I think their agents SDK is definitely a move in the right direction. It's going to be interesting that they mentioned, for example, that it is open source. Are they going to, accept pull requests from, and codes, submitted code from external people? Uh, if they do, and that makes the framework get better, you could see it get adopted very quickly, right? It might, perhaps even more so than frameworks like LangChain. The challenge that LangChain has is that they don't have a big foundation model, business to pay the bills. They've got to basically pay the bills with Langsmith, with some of the other, add-ons for LangChain that they're trying to do. OpenAI doesn't need any of that. They can just sort of go, okay, have at it, right?
Right.
As long as you're sort of keeping it on the direction we want, we're happy to sort of go with what the masses want, and they don't need to make any money off it. So that's where it could become really interesting compared to all the other frameworks, that don't have a big benefactor to actually sort of pay the bills. I do think they've got a really nice take on sort of multi-agent stuff. This idea of of defining an agent, being able to hand off things, making it pretty simple that people could, read this and work it out. I think if that takes off, and especially if you start to see them publish sort of pre-made agents. If OpenAI sort of comes out and says, right, well, if you want a customer support, triage system, here's the 6 agents that you need, and we'll just give them to you. You can try it out yourself. We've optimized all the prompts for our OpenAI models. Have at it, kind of thing. Fundamentally, to me, though, it seems like they've got a reasonably simple system. And I think this is one of the challenges that LangChain and some of the other providers are getting into, is that they are massively overcomplicating things. This is kind of like one of the nice things about what they're doing, is that they've made it simple enough so that you can extend it if you want to, but you can also keep it reasonably simple and put it into your current code base.
Right, and while we haven't had time to see if it's, production ready per se, you know,
Yeah,
in the meantime, they're saying that, hey, they have state of the art performance on this benchmark, right? They talked about 87% on Web Voyager, and then there's these other benchmarks. As you said, these benchmarks don't really mean a whole lot. They can be gamed, and it really comes down to whether they're actually useful in production. But okay, so let's wrap up, Sam. I wanted to come back to this point you were talking about, hey, the ability to do pre-built agents. And so the first comparison I wanted to make, right, as we conclude how they're comparing with, let's say, Microsoft. Remember that pod we did around Microsoft, around its event, where they had these pre-built agents, customer support, IT. In conclusion, is OpenAI way out in front with this API and SDK? How does it compare at the end of the day with Microsoft, Google, and let's say Anthropic slash AWS, right? They're kind of a team, I guess, right?
right. So look, definitely they're out in front, right? I think that's undeniable with what they've launched. I'm kind of amazed that that they launched this sort of file API and the sort of RAG search system API, which they had parts of that in the assistance API before, but it seemed like it was like just quickly done and it hadn't been thought through. The new version seems much more thought through for that. And the thing that gets me is just how simple it is for a developer now to basically just say, right, I've got these 25 PDF files that I want to have as my knowledge base. Let me just throw them up to OpenAI. They will do vector, they'll give me a vector store where I can basically do all that stuff. They will also have like, metadata searching, all that sort of stuff in there. I can either ping it to just get the raw info back, or I can ping it just as like a RAG endpoint. I think that's going to get a lot of use. Is that suddenly that's just so easy. And I gotta say, this is where Google, has dropped the ball big time. Is that, and some of the other companies probably quite similar as well, in that they've been trying to come up with 3, 4, 5 different ways to do this, to incorporate it with their current cloud offerings, etc. But they haven't got it to the point of where someone can just sort of go, right, I'm going to upload my PDFs, I'm going to put this in, and then now I can use Gemini and that for my RAGs, system. I think that everyone's going to copy OpenAI, right? We're definitely going to see a lot of people now go, oh yeah, we should have done it like that, right? And I think we'll see things like that. It's going to be very interesting to see, does Anthropic get into that game? So Anthropic has done some nice things around projects with their front end UI. The question will be, do they decide now to provide these kind of things to developers as well? And are they going to do that through Anthropic, or are they going to do that through AWS, right? Or their sort of partnerships and stuff. But I do think that OpenAI has basically planted the flag that, okay, we're here, we can help you make stuff. And here are the same tools that we're using for our agents that you can use. I'm hearing rumors of Microsoft doing their own LLMs called MAI or something. This MAI, the supposedly not just small LLMs anymore, but LLMs that are big enough that they can start using them with Copilot and stuff like that. And you got to think that, yeah, they're going to optimize for that. I think that where Microsoft has the advantage is that they've got the customer. They know what the customer wants. most people don't care about, being developers and building, API stuff and all this sort of jargon and stuff like that. They just want an agent that they can just say, right, go and do this, and it comes back and it's done.
Yeah,
And I think like that's what Microsoft is going to focus on.
right.
I think we're really starting to see some of the some of the companies like Microsoft really realize that the money is not in the models per se, it's in the products that you can make that fulfill real world needs for people, and that big companies are prepared to pay for.
Right, and some people have seen Satya Nadella's comments recently. He's made a series of interviews where he's referred to LLMs being commoditized,
Yeah.
right? Or and also kind of almost in a veiled reference to Sam Altman, right, the CEO of OpenAI. Satya has been talking about the nonsense around AGI and some of the hype there. And so some people have read into the remarks that Microsoft is backing away from OpenAI. That's probably maybe a little too much conjecture. And maybe what we're seeing now with this OpenAI play with the SDK and new API is that this could potentially continue to solidify the relationship in the sense that, hey, Microsoft knows that it's all about this, this applicable toolage, and that this is going to be really good for their own applications. I mean, obviously, Microsoft doesn't have the bring together of these, Magentic One and AutoGen in a really clean package right now.
They don't have it in the same kind of way. The interesting thing though is that they have had, really good models for doing some of the computer use stuff, which they've open sourced. They have had Magentic One, which has got a file surfer in there, a web surfer in there. So actually, kind of similar to some of the things that OpenAI's released. But I definitely think, having it in the cloud where you don't have to go and set up all this code locally or on your own servers and stuff like that. You can just ping this API and I can get back, the latest information about something. That's, pretty damn awesome. And I think that the way that, OpenAI has done it, there are a number of things that they've done which are different than the way that Google's done it. Google doesn't want to give you the actual links. They won't, actually give you the link to the URL. What they'll do is they'll give you a link to something on Google, which will redirect to that link so that the end user can go through. But if you wanted to go through and scrape it yourself, then that's going to be much harder for you to do. So my guess is that's them trying to protect their intellectual property. Again, this is one of the things where OpenAI doesn't have anything at stake to lose there, so they can just give this stuff away for free.
Good note to end it on. OpenAI is back in the lead.
They've certainly redeemed themselves this week, and they've certainly given people a lot of tools, which I think now we're going to see a lot of interesting development and acceleration.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more insights into the latest in AI for enterprise decision makers. For deeper analysis and updates, visit VentureBeat.com and sign up for our newsletters.